Hi everyone. I collected some materials together and brought you guys a little presentation. I will essentially cover two informal fallacies, the non sequitur and the begging the question fallacy, two formal fallacies, the denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent fallacies, and two logical proofs, the modus tollens and modus ponens. But I will start with the basics and defining some terms to avoid confusion. I will also briefly mention the fallacy and the fallacy variation at the end. Fallacies, the basics. Most of you probably already know this, but a quick overview for people who are new to this. A fallacy is a defect in an argument that involves mistaken reasoning. Sometimes fallacies are committed purposefully to influence or mislead the reader or listener, and sometimes unconsciously as an ego-defense mechanism. There are two main types of fallacies. 1. Formal fallacies, where there's a problem with how you structure your argument and how you're making your points. You might be speaking the truth, but the logic breaks down because of the way you're putting your arguments together. A formal fallacy is one that can be detected by examining the form of an argument. It is an argument with a premise and a conclusion that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. 2. Informal fallacies. There's a problem with what you're saying, and the information might be incorrect or misleading. Unlike formal fallacies, which are identified through examining the structure of the argument, informal fallacies are identified through the analysis of the content of the premises. In this group of fallacies, the premises fail to provide adequate reasons for believing the truth of the conclusion. There are numerous different types of informal fallacies, but I will only mention two here. To help clarify a little of the terminology used in logic for people who are not used to it, I will define two words that get used a lot: antecedent and consequent. An antecedent is the first half of a hypothetical proposition whenever the if clause precedes the then clause. A consequent is the second half of a hypothetical proposition. I will post these definitions since these are important to keep in mind, as these words get used in quick succession and unfamiliarity with them can make the logic sound confusing. To start with, I think I will go with the most common or the simple formal fallacy, the good old non sequitur. It is present within most fallacious argumentation, so it is a great start. It literally means it does not follow. It means there is a divide between the premise and the conclusion. A non sequitur is all about taking a giant logical jump that is totally unreasonable. Non sequiturs can also be just assumptions that are not necessarily true. All the following statements still take that giant leap, which defies basic reason. Marilyn drives a Mercedes. Marilyn must be wealthy. His apartment building is huge. His apartment must also be huge. Billy is eating broccoli. Billy must love to eat vegetables. NASA has pictures. The Earth must be a globe. When they say anything followed by the Earth is a globe, it generally is a non sequitur. So simply learning this single fallacy and you can stop over 95% of what the globbers use, since logically it does not follow and requires assumptions or faith. Now, because of how closely related the other fallacies I want to cover are and how it gets weaved together with them, I feel it's important to mention this informal fallacy, or the begging the question fallacy. It is probably my favorite fallacy since it is very common for the globbers to use, and it is any form of argument where the conclusion is assumed in one of the premises. Begging the question is a form of circular reasoning. The fallacy of begging the question occurs when an argument's premise assumes the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. In other words, you assume without proof the stand/position or a significant part of the stand that is in question. Begging the question is also called arguing in a circle. For example, gravity is proven by experiment. I learned in school that Cavendish is an experiment. Therefore, gravity is proven by experiment. This assumes that the school told you the truth, then using that assumption as proof, while not understanding what defines an experiment and how Cavendish does not qualify to be one, regardless of how many people believe it to be an experiment. Here is another example. If the Earth is a globe, there would be thousands of scientists saying it isn't, There are not thousands of scientists saying it isn't, therefore the Earth is a globe. Whenever they start with if, like if the Earth is a globe, or they assume an aspect of the globe to try to justify the globe, it is very likely a begging the question fallacy, as long as they end with the conclusion of any of their premises without having a valid logical format of either modus ponens or modus tollens mentioned later. They automatically are begging the question. The savvy among you probably noticed the previous example was also a different fallacy, and that is the fallacy we will talk about next. Before we delve deeper into the formal fallacies, I want to mention deductive reasoning or logical proofs, known as modus ponens and modus tollens, since the fallacies I will cover next are invalid or defective forms of those valid arguments. So let's start with the simple modus ponens. The argument form has one premise that is hypothetical if-then statement, and another premise that affirms the antecedent of the hypothetical premise. The conclusion then claims the truth of the consequent. In symbolic form, modus ponens looks like this. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Lumen Learning Logic course made a non sequitur trying to formulate a modus ponens argument showing how hard it is to be logical. Premise 1. If we get up before sunrise, then we have time for a run. Premise 2. We get up before sunrise, conclusion, so we have time for a run. While formulated correctly as modus ponens, if we get up before sunrise, then we have time for a run, does not follow necessarily, emergency, etc., and therefore makes a leap in logic, showcasing our first fallacy, non sequitur. Here is a less fallacious example of a modus ponens argument. Premise 1. If something is more dense than the medium it is in, if P, then it falls, then Q. Premise 2. Something is more dense than the medium it is in, P. Conclusion, therefore it falls, therefore Q. Next we will go over the fallacy that is the defective version of modus ponens, or affirming the consequent. Recall that one of the premises in modus ponens affirms the antecedent of the hypothetical premise. In effect, the modus ponens, the antecedent, necessitates the consequent. If the antecedent does not necessitate the consequent, it is a non sequitur fallacy. In the fallacious examples I will present next, however, the consequent is affirmed instead of the antecedent, like this. If the Earth is a sphere, if A, then we see boats disappear bottom up, then B. We see boats disappear bottom up, B. Therefore the Earth is a sphere, therefore A. The antecedent is claimed to be true because the consequent is true, but that does not mean it is. That was never confirmed, just the consequent was affirmed. So we can't affirm the consequent to prove the antecedent. Does that make sense so far? Here's one more example of this fallacy. If the Earth is a sphere, if A, then we would see the shadows like Aristophanes saw, then B. We saw shadows like Aristophanes saw, B. Therefore the Earth is a sphere, therefore A. This argument assumes the truth of the conclusion, so there is also the begging the question and non sequitur fallacies. But this form is specifically denying the antecedent. These arguments are highly illogical and can be dismantled via understanding of any of these fallacies or the correct logical argument structure. So on to our second logical argument, or modus tollens, a favorite of ours. This argument form also has one premise that is a hypothetical if-then statement, and the other premise denies or indicates the untruth of the consequent of the hypothetical premise. The conclusion then claims that the antecedent is not the case, that is, denies it. In symbolic form, modus tollens looks like this. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. We are all familiar with the black swan, so I will go over this quickly. The following are two examples I made while making this. Fact: Taylor columns form in rotated fluids. If Earth is rotating the fluid air, if P, then Taylor columns would form in all fluids on Earth, then Q. Taylor columns don't form in all fluids on Earth, not Q. Therefore the Earth is not rotating the fluid air, therefore not P. This next one I was not sure about until I read more about logic from different sources. I wonder if you guys will have a similar issue. So here goes. If imagined gravity can prevent greater gas pressure from equalizing with less pressure, if P, then we would not be able to exhale while upright against the imagined vector of gravity, then Q. We are able to exhale while upright against the imagined vector of gravity, not Q. Therefore, imagined gravity cannot prevent greater gas pressure from equalizing with less pressure, therefore not P. To help clarify in this context what my issue was, not Q simply means the denial of Q. So I used a negative claim to begin with for my Q, and then I denied it using a positive claim. So it felt very counterintuitive. I will give an example of this principle within logic from Lumen Learning next, so regardless, this is still modus tollens. To denying the antecedent. This fallacy can be seen as a defective, invalid use of the modus tollens argument form. Recall that one of the premises in modus tollens denies the consequent of the hypothetical premise. In the fallacious example to follow, however, the antecedent is denied instead of the consequent. Premise 1. If I'm cleaning the kitchen, then I'm not reading my book. Premise 2. If I'm not cleaning the kitchen, the denial of cleaning is not cleaning. Conclusion, thus I am reading my book. The denial of not reading is reading. The premise here is valid, not a non sequitur, but this too is defective reasoning, if you think about it. Not being engaged in kitchen cleaning does not by necessity infer that I am reading. I could be doing anything besides cleaning the kitchen. I also have this fallacy as used by Globers. If we would see forever, if P, then the earth would be flat, then Q. We don't see forever, not P, therefore the earth is not flat, therefore Q. There's a logical leap here between the antecedent and the consequent, so a non sequitur. We can also easily show how you would not see forever through a medium like air, so this is invalid and defective, in the content and in the form, by denying the antecedent. Generally, when they try to confirm the globe, they affirm the consequent, and when they want to deny the flat earth, they use the denying the antecedent. Make sense? The movies teach them these fallacies and more as logical deductive reasoning, so people use them unconsciously thinking they're being logical. I would class them as level 0 in logic. Level 1 hears the irrationality but can't name the logical fallacy. Level 2 can name the fallacy but struggles to help others understand how they are being fallacious. And Level 3 uses the weakness of their fallacious argumentation to show others how it is fallacious. Knowing the name alone can create an issue with the fallacy-fallacy variation where the fallacies are called but not shown. And it is important to not fall into the trap of the fallacy-fallacy where you assume whatever is argued for is wrong because they argue with fallacies. However, they should attempt to reformulate an argument without a fallacy, since that specific argument can be dismissed on the grounds of being fallacious, regardless if they're arguing for a truth. And this is the end of my presentation. Hope you and everyone else enjoyed it. I will be making more of these in the future, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.